Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My name is Abe Bonowitz, and I'm working with Ohioans to Stop Executions. And being here in a Quaker meeting, I sort of want to be silent and wait for consensus on the time to end the death penalty. But I think that would take a long time because it's an issue that a lot of people don't know a whole lot about, and that's why I'm so glad that you're all here. It's also an issue that for us in Ohio, we now have a chance to really talk about it and think about it and look at the issue less from a question of do we need the death penalty, because that's a question I always want to ask, but more important, because we have the death penalty and because we have a political situation in a legislature where it's unlikely that we're going to get rid of the death penalty anytime soon, the question really becomes, if we're going to be executing people, are we sure that the system is fair and accurate? And I think that this is a question that makes it useful for this discussion to happen in all kinds of communities, because even people who support the idea of the death penalty, I think almost everyone who supports the idea of the death penalty wants it to be fair and accurate. So that's the conversation that we're having in Ohio right now. And tonight we've got a lineup of speakers who are what I like to call voices of experience. I could talk till I'm blue in the face and give you all kinds of numbers, but I don't have any direct experience with this issue. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to share with you one story and hope that you'll have the opportunity to hear from this person directly soon. I'm sure many of you may know the case of Dr. Sam Shepard, especially those of us who are older may remember when that actually happened in 1954. Our friend, Sam Reese Shepard, woke up to a stranger in his room who helped him get dressed really quickly and scurried him out the door. And the next thing he knew, he wasn't going home. He was at a relative's house, and his dad wasn't there, and his mom wasn't there. And the next thing he knew was he was seeing headlines in the newspaper about the state seeking the death penalty for his father in revenge for the murder of his mother. The case remains unsolved because even though Dr. Shepard was convicted, 10 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court threw out that conviction and he was given a new and fair trial, and he was found not guilty and released from prison. Well, Sam grew up visiting his father in prison, and he struggles, even today, with that whole experience. He was a seeker. He grew up as a United Methodist, but he ended up becoming a Buddhist. And part of Buddhist teaching is meditation, and in particular, as a way to get rid of your anger and other emotions, there's something called walking meditation. You've ever heard somebody say, walk it off? Well, that's what Sam did. He walked in 1995 from Boston to New Orleans in what he called his walk for alternatives to violence. And everywhere he went, when he had the opportunity, he shared his story, and he talked about what it is to be the child of a murder victim and oppose the death penalty, and what it is to grow up visiting a parent in prison, and to have, as he calls it, that terror of the death penalty over his family. On that walk, Sam carried this stick, this walking stick. This was his stick, all 1,600 miles of that walk. And when he timed his walk to arrive in New Orleans at the time of a conference of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, and he put this walking stick into the auction that we then had to raise money for that effort. And I bought it. I didn't want it to be stuck in a closet somewhere. I wanted it to be shared. And that's why I wanted to share it with you tonight. I feel like there's some energy in this stick, and it's the sort of thing that's going to help us carry this conversation forward, no matter where you happen to be on this issue. There's some energy here. If you need some, take it out. If you've got some extra, put it in. But I wanted to send this around and give people a chance to have a little bit more presence with someone who's directly experienced with this issue. Our first speaker tonight is someone who has some deep experience to share. Tim Young has been the Ohio Public Defender since January 1st, 2008, after serving as a county public defender for 14 years. What county was that, Tim? Montgomery County. He has led reform efforts for indigent defense in Ohio, and he started the Ohio Wrongful Conviction Project, a non-DNA exoneration project. Tim has served on numerous boards and committees, including the American Council of Chief Defenders, the Committee on the Appointment of Counsel for Indigent Defendants in Capital Cases, and the Ohio Sentencing Commission. He's tried numerous cases throughout his career, ranging from misdemeanors to homicide cases. Tim received his BA and his JD from the University of Dayton. He's devoted his career to serving the indigent population of our society, and for the last several years, Tim has been serving on the Ohio Supreme Court Joint Task Force on the Administration of Ohio's death penalty. And here to share with us about that is Tim Young.
Thank you. When I got the call from Chief Justice O'Connor asking me to serve on the task force, I didn't immediately say yes. And the reason was because we were prohibited from discussing what I think is the ultimate question, which is, should you have a death penalty? And that was clearly off limits as part and parcel of the discussion that this task force was to have. And for me, and for my clients, and my office represents over half of death row, that was a hard decision. Should I be part of something that wasn't going to get to the question that I thought was most fundamental? At the end of the day, however, after much consultation with people much smarter than me, I ultimately decided that service on this task force was too important to pass up, that anything we could do to move the death penalty to at least a more fair application was a worthwhile endeavor. And as a result, I accepted and joined the task force, which spent over 2 years evaluating the death penalty. And I want to share with you some of what we know about the death penalty and some of the recommendations of the task force and why we arrived at them. But I think it's important to echo some of what Abe started with, and it starts with the wrong questions. People react to the death penalty very viscerally. They react to it and only answer the end question, should we have it? And they talk about things, well, what do you do with the Boston Marathon bombing? What do you do with the 9/11 bombers? What do you do with Oklahoma City? What do you do with that level of evil, if you will, that level of harm? How can there be any other answer than to put somebody who commits that act or any one of those atrocious acts other than to put them to death? And the problem with getting to that and using those as examples are that you skip the fundamental question of, do we have a system that can fairly and accurately impose that kind of punishment? Do we have a system that we have faith in? Do we have a system that makes sense? Do we have a system that you can sit back and say, we've got the right answer? That we can be satisfied not only that this person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but they committed one of the most heinous crimes, and that as a result, we should impose this ultimate punishment. And you have to back up and start talking about what we know, because the charge to our task force was to examine the Ohio death penalty statutes and determine whether they're just and fair. And if not, what can we recommend to make them more just, more fair as possible? That was our charge, without going to that ultimate question, which actually was really interesting, and I'll share this story very early in my talk, which was on the second meeting of the task force, as I pushed for the collection of data, because it seemed to me if you want to answer this question, you're going to have to know exactly what we're doing with the death penalty in Ohio and how it's imposed and what's wrong with it, if there are things that are wrong with it. And at the second meeting, a person I'll leave unnamed looked at me and said, well, why do we need data? Why can't we just adopt best practices? Whereupon I returned to the first question and thought to myself, Because best practices means we should stop having the death penalty. That's what every other state who's put a death penalty task force together has decided. The best practice is to stop. And we can get to that conclusion fairly quickly, but it's not one we're allowed to talk about. So we backed up. And I think it's important to talk about what is wrong with Ohio's death penalty. Why do these 56 recommendations come before you and hopefully before our legislature and before our Supreme Court and will become enacted? Because it is fundamentally important that we talk about this. Because at its core, I think when people talk about justice, what they mean is fairness. At its core, people have a very fundamental sense of fairness, and they want their justice system to ultimately be fair. Fair in individual application and fair in the broader scheme, in that 50,000-foot view, that the same crime, the same harm receives the same approach and same punishment, regardless of other issues. And the reality is the death penalty is the ultimate example of what's wrong with our justice system today. We have all kinds of issues that range from race to geographical disparities to value of life issues to juror bias to failure rates that are just extraordinary. And that doesn't get into cost issues or other issues that would militate against ever going forward with the death penalty. What we know when we sat down at the task force table, when we sat down, and this is the data we knew at that moment, in 1995, the Ohio Public Defender Commission, a 9-member board that ultimately hired me, thank you, found that you're 2 times as likely to receive the death penalty if the victim of the crime is white. Probably not too surprising to most people, but it tends to shut down conversations sometimes. They immediately say, well, you're accusing people of being racist. Perhaps. What I'm really doing is telling you that's unfair. Whatever the reason is, that's an unfair outcome. If your victim is white and it's twice as likely that you receive the death penalty, there's something wrong with that, and we need to address that. In 2005, because at that point when we sat down at the table, that data was now 15 years old, in 2005, the AP did a study and came in and reviewed all death indictments in the state of Ohio and reviewed outcomes and came to the exact same conclusion that 10 years later, the death penalty in Ohio still had a value of life problem. It still found that you were twice as likely to receive the death penalty if the victim of the crime was white. And in 2012, because the task force refused to collect data, and I promise you I tried. I tried. Every meeting, they got tired of listening to me. Can we do a data collection study, please? I took whatever funds we had in our office that we could afford to spend, and we did what data collection we could. I wish it were much deeper than it was, but we did collect quite a bit of data and broke new ground in some of the studies that we did. And so the Office of the Ohio Public Defender recreated much of this data in 2012 and found the exact same result. When you look at the death penalty, you are twice as likely, and our data actually found that it had gotten worse, that you're 2.5 times as likely to receive the death penalty if the victim of the crime is white. And so, as I've mentioned, you have a significant value of life problem. Is it okay in a justice system to say that whites are more valuable than minorities? And the answer has to be no. So you have to come up with recommendations that address that problem as much as possible. But that's not the only problem you come up with in the death penalty, because then you start to get to geographical problems. Ohio is a home rule state. And for those of you who aren't familiar with types of government, that means that we leave large amounts of power at the county level. Large decision-making authority is left at the county level, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. What is bad is that we don't directly or centrally report most data in Ohio, and that means that we don't know what's going on at the county level. But once you do dig around and you do find the data and you do bring together in a cumulative fashion, you find some very horrific numbers, which is that the death penalty is really, really inconsistently applied throughout the state. Prosecutors are fond of telling you, well, I represent the electorate, the people who elected me. So in this county, I'm representing the will of the people when I bring the death penalty. What that means in Ohio is you are 2.7 times more likely to be charged with the death penalty if you live in Hamilton County than anywhere else in the state. When you adjust for everything else, 2.5 times, a little more, to be charged in Hamilton County than anywhere else, compared to other big cities, 3.7 times more likely than in Cuyahoga County. So if you're in Hamilton County, just under 4 times. If you're in Cuyahoga County as being charged with a death penalty crime. 6.2 times more likely to be charged with the death penalty in Hamilton County than in Franklin County, our 3 biggest cities. When you adjust for all of the differentials, all of the other equations that you can adjust for, you come up with numbers like that. And that one always makes me ponder, the value of life problem obviously has raised its head again. But I can't decide, does it mean Hamilton County values life more or less? Not sure. I guess it depends on which side of the charge you're on at that point. But what I do know is, again, it's unfair. And in response to the prosecutor's answers, well, I represent the electorate. So Joe Dieters in Hamilton County is very proud of standing up and saying, I represent the will of the people who elected me. And my answer is, no, you don't, Joe. No, you represent your personal opinion about the death penalty. How do I know that? I can go to Cuyahoga County. Cuyahoga County had a gentleman named Bill Mason as its prosecutor for years and years and years. Bill Mason liked the death penalty a lot. In fact, he was responsible at one point for bringing 60% of all death penalty charges in this state. By the way, Cuyahoga County only has 11% of the population. In 1 year, he brought more than 40 death penalty indictments. 40. Bill Mason left office about 2 years ago. It was about 2 years ago. Right after he left, Tim McGinty came into office. Tim McGinty's been in office just a little over 2 years. 2 years, if he represents the will of the people, the way Bill Mason claims that he did, the way Joe Dieters claims that he does, the way Ron O'Brien in Franklin County claims that he does, we shouldn't see a significant change in the charging pattern, should we? I mean, this is the will of the people they're representing, not their personal predilections. So we should have 80 so indictments under Mr. McGinty. How many have we had? 4. 4. The exact same electorate, the exact same people elected them, the exact same party representation. Nothing changed in Cuyahoga County. We didn't have some major shift in political power. We didn't have some major shift in anything. What we had is a change in the single person who makes the charging decision. So you have this huge geographical disparity across the state that is based upon the personal predilections of the person who's been elected the county prosecutor. And don't hear me wrong. I believe these people honestly intend to do what they believe is right, what they believe is the right thing. They are honest and genuine about believing that in most instances. Don't choke, Joe. They really do. Many of them really, most of them, all of them, really honestly, truly believe they're doing the right thing, but they're being, at a minimum, self-deceptive if they're telling you that they represent the electorate. They don't, not in this decision, and the data tells us that. Beyond controversy, the data tells us that. So we have that value of life problem, we have the racial disparity, we have the geographical disparity, and we're just getting started in problems with fairness in the death penalty in Ohio as it's been applied to, there are almost 150 people on death row today. Let's talk about juries. Juries are supposed to be representatives of the community, peers, correct? Well, unfortunately, there's this little thing in the death penalty called witherspooning. It's named after the case of Witherspoon. Witherspoon says that the only jurors who are in favor of the death penalty can serve on death penalty juries. Well, I guess if you want to have a death penalty, you're going to have that rule in place, because then anytime you got one person who said, I don't believe in it, you'd never have a death penalty. But it also means you eliminate any sense of fairness of a representative jury from this community coming together, because you have selectively said, I'm only taking this group of people who hold this belief. Maybe that's not so bad, but let's talk about people who hold that belief. What we know about people who believe in the death penalty, who are strongly in favor of the death penalty, who say, yes, I can serve on that jury, yes, I can hand down a death verdict, are far more likely to convict in the first instance on any jury. They're far more likely to find people guilty. It's an interesting bias going in for somebody who's being charged and being defended for their life to have to face a jury that's far more likely to convict them in the first instance. And it eliminates a really discrete sector of the community that the government claims it represents in favor of another sector of the community. It's chosen one side over another. It has said, we choose death penalty over non-death penalty. We value that view more. Another bias in our system, another unfairness. Witherspooning is by its very, very nature absolutely unfair. And then you have the outcome problem with the death penalty. Many people say it's like lightning, and that's probably true. Receiving a charge that includes a death specification is a lot like lightning, being struck by lightning. The odds are about the same. The rationale is about the same. There's very little sense when you look at crimes across this state that I can't find 10 murders that have very similar fact patterns that were never charged as death penalty murders for every single one that was. And so these failed outcomes, and let's start with one that's called the 1 for 10 problem. There's a British journalist who came to America, very interested in the death penalty, and he found this very, very interesting number. And I would encourage you actually to go to this website if you're curious in following it. It's called 1 for 10. And it has this number, and this number is fairly shocking. For every 10 people executed in the United States, 1 has been set free. Not set free in terms of just spending the rest of their life in another jail. Absolutely walk out the door innocent. Did not commit the crime. 1 for 10. I want you to think about that for a minute. That's a government failure rate that's pretty extreme. If somebody didn't come pick up your trash every 11th week, you'd be pretty angry. If every 11th day you went to turn on your water and it didn't work, if your water, your city water system had that level of failure rate, people would be demanding change. If your newspaper didn't show up every 11th day, you would demand change. And so it has always been astonishing to me that we have that level of failure rate, but people are not marching down to our courthouses demanding change, because that is an extraordinary failure rate. And it's not the only failure rate we need to be aware of. Many, many prosecutors regularly publish annual reports that talk about success rates, conviction rates, and they'll say, we have a 90% conviction rate. And what they're telling you is that 90% of the time, the person that they have charged with a crime is being convicted of the highest level crime they've been charged with. They may plea bargain lessers, but they're saying 90% of the time I charged this person with burglary, they were convicted of burglary by plea or by trial. That's their measure, not mine. That is a measure that is commonly, you go to ask a prosecutor, every single prosecutor in the state, all 88 can tell you their conviction rate. Any given day, they can tell you what that number is. That's their number, not mine. Let's look at that then. When you look at the death penalty, the charge, if they're going to be successful by their own measure, means that they should be getting a death verdict. How often do they get a death verdict for every 100 death penalty cases they bring? 5%. 95% of the time, by their own measure, they are not achieving the outcome they claimed, that this crime was so heinous, so horrible, the worst of the worst. 95% of the time, they're wrong. There are problems, and this is what we sat down with. And I commonly tell people, look, if the government's failing at something 95% of the time, perhaps we should stop. But that wasn't our charge, once again. But this was the data we knew. We knew when we sat down at the table. We knew these are uncontroverted numbers. I brought up all of this data at the table. There were prosecutors at this table. The Attorney General had a representative at the table. There were judges who across the spectrum from very conservative, what you might think of as hanging judges, to more liberal judges. We had the whole spectrum. We had professors at the table. This was a representative community of people who worked in the justice system, who had deep experience with the death penalty, who had worked around it, and not one time did anybody ever bring a single set of data, a single study, a single report that controverted anything I just told you. And so what we sat down with was the uncontrovertible evidence that the death penalty in Ohio is absolutely unfair as the process exists today. And so we started our process of examining what recommendations we could make to change it. As I said, we did it without enough data. I wish we had more, but we did make 56 recommendations, each and every one of them designed to address one of those geographical disparities, racial disparities, outcome problems, witherspooning issues, all of those, the personal predilections of the prosecutors. Every single recommendation we made addresses one of those problems. Every single one. People commonly say, well, Tim, that's a lot of recommendations. Which ones should we really take up? All of them. Every single one of them. What do you mean, which ones should we take up? All of them. We didn't spend 2 years debating useless topics. We didn't spend 2 years going, you know what, these are the 3 really important ones. Let's spend 18 months talking about 53 really unimportant ones. 56 really important recommendations. They ranged across the board, and let me just give you an example of things that we did recommend. The report is available online. Anybody who wants it, the Supreme Court has it posted on their website, fairly easy to find. If you can't find it, don't hesitate to email me, contact me. I'm more than happy to provide it to you. I'm sure Abe also would. But we made a number of recommendations. One of them, get rid of felony murder. And this requires some explanation. The death penalty is not eligible for all murders. The death penalty has always been defined for the worst of the worst. What are the most heinous murders? What are the worst murders? Not all murders are the worst murders. I understand all murder is bad. We can all agree on all murder is bad. All murders are not the worst murders. By definition, some have to be worse than others. And when you start with that, you have to start examining, what do we give the death penalty for? What kinds of crimes are eligible for the death penalty? If not all murders, then only specific types of murders. To give you examples, murder of a child. If you're gonna have the death penalty, I guess that one makes sense. 5 children. I'm gonna be a little soft there. Multiple murders, if you kill more than one person at the same time. If you murder a police officer. But we also have this class of things called felony murder. Somebody comes in here with a gun and says, I'm going to rob you. Give me your wallet. Give me your purse. Give me your cell phone. That's called an aggravated robbery. If they shoot you in the course of that, that's a felony murder. They've committed a murder in the course of an aggravated felony. The 5 types of felony murder in Ohio are aggravated robbery, aggravated burglary, arson, kidnapping, and rape. And what we found is, when we did the studies, that last study we did in 2012, is that when you look at murder and connect the death penalty with the specific type of specification that exists, first and foremost, the conviction rates in the felony murder realm are about 2%. Really, really bad. So for every 100 people charged with the death penalty for an aggravated robbery murder, 2 receive a death verdict. 98% of the time, the prosecutor or a jury says no. That's after they've decided this was the worst of the worst. The other thing we found was there was a dramatic increase in race bias involved in felony murder decisions, and a dramatic increase in geographical bias involved in felony murder. So the recommendation was, get rid of it. You can eliminate both geographical bias and race bias at a fairly high level. You're not going to eliminate it from our system. You're just not. But you can reduce it significantly by simply getting rid of those as choices. One, they're not being used much anymore. When you talk about a 2% rate, that compares to multiple murder victims, which is the highest rate, which runs at about 36 to 40%. So you take 100 cases where multiple people have been killed, 36 to 40% of the time the person will receive the death penalty if they were charged with a death penalty specification. 36 compared to 2. It's a very dramatic difference. The most racist charge in Ohio that receives the death penalty? Rape. You can't get the death penalty for rape. There's a misconception there. It's for murder while committing a rape. So when somebody, obviously almost always a woman, is being raped and ultimately is killed, that is felony murder that comes out of a rape. But it is the most racist form that we have. Why do I say that? Well, when you look at the numbers, 25% of the time when the victim was white, death verdict was imposed. How many times do you suppose when the victim was black was a death verdict imposed? We have a winner. 0. 0. Not once did a jury find it worthwhile to impose the death penalty when the victim of the crime was black. It is the most racist charge we have in terms of outcomes that include the death penalty. So that was one recommendation we made. We also said that there should be a recommendation that there should be a Racial Justice Act. Makes sense. You should be allowed to collect statistical data, and if you can show a racial bias in charging patterns or other patterns that led to the result in your case, you shouldn't receive the death penalty. We're not saying you should be set free, but we should certainly get rid of the death penalty if race had some substantial impact in the outcome of your case, and if we can prove it through statistical data collection, you should be allowed to do so. Makes sense? One, again, we need to address race. We should also mandate that all death penalty homicides should be centrally reported. We should never be sitting in a room again going, gee, we don't have a lot of data about this. We need to have good data from here and forever forward. We need to know exactly what's going on, because if we don't keep track of it, we're just going to keep sliding backwards into these huge disparities that I've already listed for you. Another big area that we discussed was mental health. The seriously mentally ill. Should we really be executing people who are seriously mentally ill? And you'll hear from people, oh, we already have protections for that. We have not guilty by reason of insanity, or we have incompetence. I need to tell you that the law really sucks on mental illness. You take 100 people who the average citizen, or even a psychotherapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist would say, yes, seriously mentally ill, the law would find perhaps 2 of them incompetent to stand trial and maybe 5 of them not guilty by reason of insanity. The law defines insanity in such a very, very narrow way that it does not encompass people who have severe depression, bipolar, schizophrenic. There are people who are actively schizophrenic who are not insane according to the law, which is in itself a little insane. So you have these huge issues that we should never be imposing the ultimate punishment on people who have some sense of diminished capacity. That's just mean. There's just a sense of real meanness to picking on a group of people. And when I say that knowing that about half, if not far more than half, of death row today has serious mental illness. There are those who say it's as high as 80 or 90%. I will stand here and tell you I have zero doubt that half of death row is easily diagnosable with a severe mental illness today. Half. That's 75 men on death row today. What you don't see in the death penalty is the imposition on somebody who's completely sane, white, and middle class, except in the rarest of rarest instances. We impose the death penalty upon poor people who have had incredibly troubled lives, largely minorities, although not exclusively in any way, but you don't ever see it being imposed upon people who don't have those strikes, if you will, going in. We also want real basic things. One recommendation, maybe we should have all crime labs in Ohio, I don't know, accredited. I know, seems kind of obvious, doesn't it? We debated that one for like 3 days. There was actually debate on that, whether they should be accredited, whether the blood or any other bodily fluid should be tested in an accredited lab, a lab that has passed basic functioning of how you do a scientific test. Gee, I think that's only fair. I think every case should be tested only in accredited labs, but at a minimum, all death penalty cases should be. Seems simple. There's actually a debate on whether we should even take that one up. Stunning to me. That we should fund the death penalty on a statewide basis. Do you know today, based upon home rule, there are counties that pay as little as $6,000 to defense counsel for representing somebody in a death penalty case? $6,000. That's ridiculous. The ceiling my office authorizes for death penalty representation is $75,000. Just to give you an idea of what we think is even remotely fair. I honestly think that number should probably be much closer to $150,000 to $200,000. There are budgetary issues involved in some of those decisions, but 6 is just silly. Most counties, the number is $25,000 for 2 lawyers, 12 and a half each, 25 grand. Most death penalty cases will require 6 months of a lawyer's life if they do it right. 6 months full time, 12 and a half grand. That means that lawyer is going to make about $25,000 a year. That means the lawyer is working for poverty. Poverty in America to represent somebody who is charged with the death penalty. These are just really basic fundamental flaws that people talk about. Yes, we should have a death penalty. We shouldn't have a death penalty under a system like that. You have to address these things. We should have litigation fund not just to pay lawyers, but for all capital costs, the lab fees, experts. Given how many people on death row have serious mental illness, perhaps we should be testing, I don't know, some basic mental functioning. We should be doing basic function. To do a really good analysis of somebody, it's $5,000 to hire a very good psychiatrist to come in and do the battery of tests you really want done. $5 grand to walk in the door. Cuyahoga County passed a cap of $3,000 for all expert fees. Everyone, everything you need, $3 grand. That's one of the richer counties in this state. $3 grand. No, you don't need more. You don't need all those tests. Science. It'll get in the way, right? We've got things to do. So I have gone on and on and on, and I can go through all 56, and I promise you I'm not going to. I just want to give you a flavor of the kinds of recommendations that we made and the reasons why we made them, because I think it's fundamental, more important than the actual recommendations, to understand why we made them. Because if you understand the system has this value of life problem, if you understand the system has this race outcome problem, if you understand the system has this massive geographical disparity problem and has this failure rate problem, then you start to accept, I don't care who you are, in favor of the death penalty, not in favor of the death penalty, we can all agree the system doesn't work and we should change it if we're going to continue down this course. And so the work of the task force is vitally important if Ohio wants to continue on the path that it does. And it does today. As Abe mentioned, our Ohio legislature is probably not anywhere close to considering getting rid of the death penalty. So if we're going to continue it, then we need to approach our legislators. We need to talk to them and make sure they understand it's not about, oh, yes, we must have it, or no, we shouldn't have it. It's got to be about, if we have it, we have got to fix these things. And that means you take up all 56 recommendations and implement them immediately before the next case is prosecuted, before the next person is charged, before the next person in this state is executed. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. We're going to have time for questions after we hear from all 4 of our speakers. And also, in a little while, we're going to pass out one of these to each of you, which has, on one side, more information about the task force, including links directly to not only the Supreme Court website, but also the Ohioans to Stop Executions website, where we've put up a searchable database. So you can click on innocence, for example, and get all of the recommendations that are related to innocence and look at them and read them for yourselves. So we'll be passing that out. There's so many things I want to say after hearing that, but the one thing I want to point out is that this is the second of 3 nights in a row that we're doing one of these talks in some place around the state, and we're doing them as frequently as we can, and in as many different places as we can, because we think it's important that Ohioans have a chance to understand that this has happened, that this process, this study has happened, that there are these recommendations and what they really mean. Because it's so easy to dismiss them, which is what has happened so far with the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association basically has said, well, the whole thing is just a ploy by anti-death penalty people, just throw it out and don't take any of these recommendations. And Tim, how many defense attorneys were on that panel? How many prosecutors? Sorry? Sure. Okay, so 3 defense attorneys, 4 prosecuting attorneys, 3. How many judges? Sorry, I'm going to make him look, but it's like 8 or 10 judges, right? It's about 8 or 10 judges, people who are trained to be impartial, a number of professors, academics, people like that. The majority of the task force were not people that are on one side or the other of a courtroom. They're people who are trained to study and to come up with impartial information. And last night we had Franklin County Judge McIntosh, who is a former prosecutor, who stood and shared with us his perspective. And you could just tell how insulted he felt as a judge when people were saying, just throw this out because all of your work was irrelevant and you are a biased anti-death penalty person. That's a former prosecutor who's now a judge. Tomorrow night, we'll be in Springfield, and the chairman of the task force, Judge Brogan, another former prosecutor who put people on death row. And these people are incensed that we don't even want to hear about this. We prosecutors don't want the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association. I don't think it's any one particular, but it's a couple of prosecutors really. But if you talk to the individual ones, if you talk to the prosecutor in this county, I bet if you asked, to him, right? I bet if you asked him, he might be able to be a bit more candid, okay? The Prosecuting Attorneys Association is going to the newspapers and going to the legislature and saying, don't even listen to any of this. And that's why we wanted to bring it to people. So we'll have some more information that you can take home and do more of your own study, but more importantly, hopefully share some of what you're hearing tonight. So Tim gave us our statistical and academic analysis with a particular flair that we're not getting from most of the task force members that are presenting in this, and we appreciate that, Tim. But our next 3 speakers are people that have been in the fire of this issue. Terry Collins is practically coming home. He's from Hillsborough, just down the road. He comes with a lot of experiences. His background is academic credentials, a Bachelor of Science, Sociology, Criminology, and Corrections from Moorhead University, and a Master's in Correctional Administration from Xavier University. And I just want to quote somebody who made a comment on his LinkedIn site. This is a person that, to quote this attorney, Terry could be my favorite witness ever. I want to stop and say he's also one of my favorite witnesses ever. He could be my favorite witness ever. He's clear and incisive and speaks with the simple power that can only come from honesty. Please welcome Terry Collins.
Good evening. Well, as Abe said, I am from a little town a few miles down the road that way, Hillsborough. I used to come to Wilmington and play the Hurricanes every once in a while. A few years ago. As you know, Hillsborough, probably similar to Wilmington, a social conservative, religious town. You went to church on Sunday morning, you went to church on Sunday evening, you went to church on Wednesday evening. I was raised by my grandparents, and we lived right next door to the church, so it wasn't a long trip to walk across the driveway. I strongly believe then, and I strongly believe now, in punishment of those who violate the laws of society. And I know many people who are in prison now who should never get out. Okay. I worked 32 and a half years in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. My last 3.5 years I spent as the director of the agency. I started my career in 1977, retired in February 2010. I worked at Lucasville as my originating prison. I went from there to London, to Lorraine, back to Lucasville after the riot in 1993, to Ross, to central office. So I've been a warden in 3 prisons, have worked all security levels. As the director, I had about 50,000 plus inmates, roughly 12,000 employees, and spent on a yearly basis $1.8 billion of your money to incarcerate people in this state, somewhere in the neighborhood of 28, 29, 30 prisons, give or take budget when we were moving things around. $1.8 billion of your tax dollars go to criminal justice just to operate the prisons in this state. I think that's about 1.5 now. Director Moore, who's a friend of mine, actually just lives a couple miles from me. I currently live in Chillicothe, is the director, and I think his budget's about $1.5 billion. The death penalty was not something I thought about growing up in Hillsboro, Ohio. But when I got to Lucasville in 1977, fresh out of college, I seen this person leave the prison one morning, and that person never came back. And it was a young man by the name of Gary Beeman. Gary was on death row. Death row was housed at Lucasville when I first started there in 1977. Gary served as his own attorney and went back to a county in northern Ohio. I think it was Ashtabula, but don't quote me on that. I just know it was in northern Ohio. Gary never came back because Gary was found not guilty, serving as his own attorney. The inquisical part of me asked what happened to Gary, and they said, well, he got found not guilty. He's not coming back to the prison anymore. I interviewed those inmates who left death row in 1979 or 80 because the death penalty in this state was ruled unconstitutional. So I was involved bringing those people off death row. 1994, I was the warden at Lucasville after the riot. Was the first time we'd taken anybody and placed them in the death house at Lucasville. I took an inmate by the name of John Bird out of cell block at Lucasville, walked him down the hallway, put him in the death house, started what we called the death watch. At that time, inmates had the opportunity to choose electric chair lethal injection. That law was changed, I think, in 2001 or 2. That was when we also did executions at midnight. So on Saturday afternoon, we took John out of death row, walked him down the hallway to the death house, and on Monday night, early Tuesday morning actually, walked John back because the United States Supreme Court had given him a stay. I was the warden at Lucasville in 1995 when we moved death row to Mansfield. During my time period from 1977 to 2010, I witnessed 33 executions in this state and 1 in the state of Texas. So I have been there and understand the death penalty. A lot of people have said to me, well, why has your stance about the death penalty changed? Well, I was a government employee. I was appointed by the governor of the state of Ohio, appointed once by Robert Taft, appointed a second time by Governor Strickland. And I was asked about my stance on the death penalty basically after every execution. And my stance was simply this, that it was the law of this state and my responsibility was to carry out the law of the state. I've since retired, so I don't have to be politically correct. I don't have to tell people things to make them feel good because I'm not running for any office. I don't plan to run for any office, and my stance has changed because of a couple different things. One, you heard a lot from Tim, fairness of the system. Whether or not you're on death row shouldn't be based on what county you come from, how much money you had, your economic status, or your race. Should not be determined in reference to whether or not you end up on death row. I don't accept the explanation that death penalty cases are given only to the worst of the worst. I've walked the hallways of every prison in this state multiple times. I worked in maximum security prison for 7 years. And I've run into a lot of people who were a whole lot worse than the people that was on death row, and their cases were much worse. So I don't buy the argument about we only save the death penalty for the worst of the worst. Not true. I'll give you a prime example of that. Knox County, Ohio. Maybe 3 years ago, a young gentleman killed 2 ladies, 2 children. The dog stuffed them in a tree. And I told my wife, who's here with me tonight, that guy will not get the death penalty. And she said, well, that's a pretty bad case. And I said, yeah, it's one of the most horrific cases that I'd seen. But he didn't get the death penalty. He got a plea bargain. He's currently in the state prison system doing life without parole. So I don't accept the explanation that only the worst of the worst get the death penalty. We probably live in the greatest country in the world, no doubt. We probably have the greatest criminal justice system in the world, no doubt, but it does make mistakes. Gary Beeman was one of those mistakes. You're going to listen to a person in a little bit that was one of those mistakes. Dale Johnston was another mistake. 6 people in this state have been let off death row because they were found to be not guilty. 140-some people across this country have been let off of death row because they were not guilty. I personally have walked 3 people out of prison who were later to be found not guilty. 1977, I had a young man on my caseload. I started as a social worker in the system. Most people look at me and say, you wouldn't be a social worker. But that's what I started as. But this young man was on my caseload, and he kept telling me every time I'd see him, and we had to do 6-month reviews of institutional adjustment, he'd tell me, Mr. Collins, I'm not guilty. And my response every time was, you may not be, but the law says you are, the court said you are, and so therefore I got to assume that you are because you're here with me. 12 years later, 10 or 12 years later, London Correctional Institution. I walk him out the front door to the steps of that prison, and if anybody's ever been to that prison, you got a big set of steps going down front. We got to the top of the steps, and he said, Mr. Collins, I told you I wasn't guilty. It only took about 12 or 13 years for them to figure that out, but he was not guilty, and the only thing I could say was, I'm sorry. I wasn't the one who put you here, but I'm the one who's letting you go today. I walked one other person out who was doing an aggravated murder case. He'd done 14 years, and eventually found that person who was living in Germany at the time. I walked him out the front door of that same prison. I changed my stance because Ohio has an option, and that option is called life without parole. Life without parole means you will not be released from prison. You do not see the parole board. The only way you get out of prison if the judge changes his mind, if the appellate court overrules the judge's sentence, and the prosecutor decides he's not going to give you a new trial. But with life without parole, you don't leave prison. I hear a lot of people say, well, they could. They can't unless the system had messed up. It's impossible. Life without parole. How many people are currently in the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections? Life without parole became a law in this state in either 96 or 97. Today, I checked their website today. They put a monthly report out. That monthly report has a lot of different things on it. But one of the things it has on it is how many people are currently in the system that are doing life without parole. 474 people as of July of this year were incarcerated in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections for life without parole. On September the 5th of this year, they said there was 138 people on death row. I wonder if those 474 people would have been on death row if we didn't have life without parole. Because if you look statistically, if you go back and look at history, after 1996, the number of people committed to death row in the state of Ohio dramatically dropped. Sometimes only 1 or 2 a year. But our numbers on life without parole were going up at a dramatic rate. Another interesting fact, and I checked this out today, I knew it to be true, and I've always known it to be true. There's many people currently on death row who never had the option of life without parole. In fact, I asked the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction today, how many people are on death row that were sentenced prior to 1997? Prior to 1997. That means they've been there for 17 years. There's 62 people currently on death row that were there prior to 1997. That's roughly 45% of the people on death row never had an option for life without parole. I wonder how many of those people would not be there if that option was available. Maybe another recommendation should have been we go back and look and see whether or not we should give those people that option as to whether or not they should be there. 62 people currently set on death row in this state that didn't have an option of life without parole. I would venture to say, looking at historical data, from when life without parole came into effect and then people came on death row, that probably 80 to 90% of those people would not be sitting on death row today. I've seen effect on victims after 10, 15, 20 years of the appeals and continued reliving of events. Every execution that I attended, 33 of them in this state, witnessed 33, I would leave my house in Chillicothe, Ohio, drive to Lucasville. Usually left the house 10 till 6, took me about 40, 45 minutes to drive to Lucasville. Listening to the radio talking about the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections carrying out execution today. I'd get to Lucasville, roughly around 7 o'clock, go to the warden's office, sit and talk with the warden, see if there was any other legal action that had been going on throughout the evening and throughout the night. At 9 o'clock, I left and went to the media center where all the media were housed. It was kind of funny. The first probably 20 executions that we did, a lot of media. The last two, wasn't anybody there. If it hadn't been for a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch, wouldn't have been anybody there. The media even lost interest in what the state was doing. At 9 o'clock, I went to the media center. At 9:15, I went and met with the victim's family that was on site in attendance at the execution. Some of them would attend and view the execution. Some of them were there merely as support. I would leave there, usually around 9:20, walk across the yard to the death house, go in the death house and talk to the team members that was there that was doing the constant watch, and talk to the person that was going to be executed, the condemned inmate, and spoke to every one of them, usually somewhere around 9:30. Things worked on it. You did certain things at certain times, because if you missed it by a minute, somebody was saying, uh-oh, you had a problem. I would leave there and go inside the room where the team members that were involved with the process and talk with them. At about 9:45, I'd get into the witness room where the injections were done and the telephones were there. I would call the governor's office and make sure that there was no last-minute stays and that the governor was not going to grant a reprieve. And then we'd put the Attorney General on the phone, and then we'd proceed. So I got to talk to those victims. And we often talk about the victims of the person who was murdered, but we also had on site the family members of that person who was being executed. They were in essence victims too. And it was probably tougher to talk to them than it was the victims of the family who'd been murdered. They were living an event that day where they weren't going to see their loved ones. And we tried to always make sure they were kept separate, and we had somebody from our victim services there. But I think oftentimes we forget about the fact that oftentimes the family members of that person who's condemned were victims too. I've seen the effect on staff who conduct executions, probably the hardest job in this state. They're a fine group of staff from the Southern High Correctional Facility who volunteered to do one of the toughest jobs there is. And believe me, it does change people. I've seen them sweat trying to get in injection sites. I've seen them worry about going to court. I've seen them worry about whether or not people would know who they were because of what they were afraid that people may do to them or to their families. So I've seen that effect. But the one thing that I always ask, all 33 times I went there, did the system get it right? And everybody says, well, Mr. Collins, this guy's had 27 judges look at this case, and you know what? Those 27 judges didn't care about anything other than was the I's dotted and the T's crossed. Was the procedures granted? They didn't care whether there was new evidence, whether the person was guilty, not guilty. They didn't care about any of that. They cared about whether the process was carried out. I don't know for a fact that anybody that I ever witnessed be executed was not guilty, but statistical data would probably say that there's a good probability of that, of the 33 that I've seen in this state and the one I've seen in the state of Texas. I think it's imperative that we educate society about the death penalty and the criminal justice system. And meetings of this nature help do that. People don't really understand the criminal justice system, and they certainly don't understand the death penalty. And I have a lot of friends who have somewhat changed their opinion about the death penalty in discussions that we've had. In closing, I believe that Ohio should do away with the death sentence it would have no harmful effect on this state for us not to have a death penalty. In fact, it would probably be considered progressive in most cases. We have life without parole, a punishment already frequently used, and is more than sufficient to handle those cases that are of a dire and oftentimes very bad case. I understand it's an emotional issue, and we have to look at the facts and use good moral judgment and social values in deciding what is best for society. I reviewed the task force recommendations. I didn't sit on the task force. I wasn't asked to testify at the task force, but I have looked at the recommendations. To me, they make common sense judgment. I fully support that the legislature takes swift and affirmative action on these recommendations. I know that's probably not going to happen as I stand here tonight, because it wouldn't be the proper thing to do from a political standpoint. And I would tell them that if they were here in this audience. They know that I used to meet with legislators almost on a daily basis when I was the director, and a lot of times they didn't like what I had to say, and oftentimes they didn't like what they had to say. But I believe that they should take immediate action. But I do believe that there's one that should have immediate action tomorrow without pause, without debate, without hesitation, to pass legislation that nobody who is seriously mentally ill will face a death penalty in this state. We don't even need to debate that issue. They don't even have a hearing on it. It could be done immediately, without pause, without hesitation. Secondly, they must enact recommendations on how to support victims' families. Those two recommendations don't even need to be talked about. Should be done immediately. I don't think that will happen, but hopefully there will be some movement to do that. It's been my pleasure to be here with you this evening, and thanks for having us.
Thank you, Terry. Again, I'm going to be sending you home with at least one of these. You can take as many as you like. We've got a big box of them. Because on this side, it tells you about these recommendations. On the other side, it shares some of the statistical information, which was just synopsized from a report we put out about last April, called the Death Lottery, how race and geography determine who goes to Ohio's death row. One of the reasons that we're here in Wilmington is because your representative is Cliff Rosenberger. Does anybody here know Cliff Rosenberger? I hope you'll let him know about what you're hearing tonight and the request that we have that the legislature give a full and fair hearing to these recommendations and not just dismiss them out of hand. He needs to hear from people that have voted for him or that live in his district who are his constituents, and we'll talk more about that. And not just Cliff Rosenberger, but every legislator needs to hear from Ohioans who want to get it right if we're going to have executions at all. Getting it right. You know, when we put somebody on death row, the idea is that we got it right. The idea is that this is the person that has done this crime. And so many people, myself included, have said, well, the jury convicted him, the police arrested him, must have done it, you know. Well, so far in this state, we have exonerated and freed 6 people who have been sent to death row. That's out of 146 people that are on what's known as the official list of people who've been exonerated. Out of those 146, by the way, DNA was only a factor in 20 of those cases. DNA is not the magic bullet. I think that's one of the things I'm very pleased about the Innocence Project that Tim helped start up, is that they are looking at all cases, not just DNA cases. When you hear about Barry Scheck's Innocence Project in New York City, all they talk about is DNA cases. 20 out of 146. But there's a whole nother set of those exonerees I want to make sure to mention that are people who, because they'd been in prison for a long time and they were offered an opportunity to walk out today if you plead guilty to a lesser offense, or face another trial, face another death sentence. There's one guy, Kerry Max Cook, went to trial 4 times, went to death row repeatedly. Kirk Bloodsworth, the first person who was exonerated using DNA technology, his original conviction was overturned and he was sentenced to life in prison on his second conviction, and it turns out he had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. DNA proved it, that he was not the killer. Point is that DNA is not the magic bullet, and that in most of these cases, it's not DNA that gets people out. When you're telling people about what you've heard today, I want you to listen very carefully, because I want you to be able to repeat the next story that you hear. Because it could be you. It could be your child. It could be somebody you know. Please welcome Joe D'Ambrosio.
First, let me apologize for my coughing. My bronchitis is acting up, and I'm over here hacking while all these people are trying to talk. I was sentenced to death in Ohio and spent 22 years of my life on death row in Ohio. I am the 6th and last exoneree in the state of Ohio. And it's not because I was a criminal beforehand. I was never in trouble before with the law. I was an honorably discharged sergeant, classified as a war veteran. And yet they took the word over a man that was an alcoholic, drug addict, welfare cheat, and was dishonorably discharged from the military because of violence over me. Because if you get hooked up into this system and you don't have power, money, or influence, and you don't know the system at all, it can't happen to you. Very simply. I have the shortest death penalty trial in the state of Ohio's history, 2 3/4 days, because I listened to my attorney. 2 3/4 days. The hearing that I was granted to see if I was entitled to a retrial lasted 3 days. Longer than my trial that put me on death row and almost got me executed. Mr. Tate was my warden at Lucasville for a while. It was very, very hard. The hardest thing, it was a 22-year nightmare. And it all started because I got out of the military and was looking for a job. I moved into an area in April of 1988. I was hired to do landscaping work on September of 1988, September 1st. September 26th, I was sitting in jail, charged with murder, and had not a clue what they were talking about. They were accusing me of killing this 19-year-old kid, cutting him up and throwing him in a creek and leaving him there. And I didn't have one iota of an idea of what was going on and what they were talking about, or the people that were taking the stand and lying about me. I wasn't the only co-defendant. I had another co-defendant who was also on death row and is right now out on bond because his judge threw out his conviction. And hopefully he will be the next exoneree out of the state of Ohio. But it's all because one man stood up and pointed his finger at us and said, they did it while I stood there and watched. And the police took his word for it. The morning of September 26th, I got up, normal day of work, went to the bathroom, was sitting on the toilet. Next thing I know, my bathroom doors kicked in. I see 2 guys in plain clothes pointing pistols at me. I'm like, oh my God, I'm dead. It's a house robbery, it's something. As soon as they said police, I'm like, oh, okay, you got the wrong house, something. You know, it doesn't bother me that the police are in here, except for how did you get into my apartment? But that's a whole nother subject. But they wouldn't even let me wipe my butt. They stood me up, handcuffed me, threw me on the floor in my living room, and said, we're going to kill you for killing this kid. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Clueless. And the funny thing is, where they arrested me is approximately the same size as my cell that I lived in for 22 years. If you take your average sized bathroom, take the door, lock it, take the doorknob off, of course, take a mattress, throw it on your bathtub, and live in that. That's approximately the size of my cell. So where they arrested me, I then served the rest of the 22 years in the same size room. And no matter who you say or how you say it or who you tell, no one wants to listen to you. I had court-appointed attorneys. One was running for a mayor of a little town at the time and couldn't be bothered. And the other one just thought I was knocked down guilty. I did everything that they told me to do because I'm thinking, well, I was never in trouble before. The system works. I'm going to let my attorney do what he wants, and anything he asks of me, I'll do. Well, he slid a piece of paper in front of me and said, here, sign this. We want to go with a 3-judge panel. Worst mistake I ever could have made. Because after I was convicted, every time I bring an issue up on appeal, they kept saying it's a 3-judge panel. It's harmless error because the judges know better. And I didn't know any better. And you're supposed to be intelligently waive your jury trial, and I didn't have a clue what they were talking about. And it was the longest nightmare of my life to sit there day after day knowing you're innocent and have execution dates. I came within 3 days of being executed because my attorney didn't file the proper motion. Luckily, I knew enough to contact another attorney to have him file the motion on my behalf. But it's that kind of representation that you get that is so dangerous. They are underfunded. I'll give them that. The Ohio Public Defenders, I give my hat off to them. They have 15, 20, 25 guys. Well, death row isn't as big as when I was on it. When I was on death row, there was 126 or 226 guys on death row. So their caseload was even worse. It's been knocked down between executions and getting them off of death row. But the attorneys that I was given, to say they were clowns is giving them too much credit because they didn't want to hear that I was innocent. The sad thing is the system didn't work to free me. The system did not work to free me. God sent me a priest to come and help me. And it had to be God because I had no luck, because look where I was. I was on death row. So it shows you I have no luck. But I prayed. I prayed every day. And everyone couldn't understand. So how can you pray to that God of yours? You're still here on death row. 2 decades you're here on death row. How do you keep praying to the same God? I said, because I'm here and I'm on God's time. When God wants me to be released, or if God didn't want me to be released. That was his scheme, and it was a purpose. But he answered my prayers. He sent me Father Neil, who not only was a Catholic priest, was an attorney and a registered nurse. And he had to be all 3 things to do what he did for me. And there is no other priest in the world that has all 3 credentials. And the odds of the guy in the cell next to me that was actually writing him initially, telling him, "You think my case is messed up, you should talk to the guy in the cell next to me." Lucky he did. Right around that time, my mother died. And Father Neil knows death row doesn't go to funerals. So he went and commemorated my mother's funeral. The next time he came down to talk to the guy that was in the cell next to me, he asked the guards, "Can I see Joe D'Ambrosio?" Now, they didn't have to do that. And most of the guards knew all I did from the time I got up to the time I went to sleep was work on my case, so I didn't cause any trouble. And they were nice enough to allow me to talk to them. Well, up to this point, it was 10 years I was on death row. I wrote every journalism school, every law school, every innocent project, all the media, all the papers. I wrote everybody. No one wants to listen to the dead man walking. No one wants to hear the guy in the orange jumpsuit say he didn't do it. Oh, they all say that. But now I had an individual, a live human being in front of me, locked in the same cell, because he ain't getting out. It was in a room, but he's locked in there with me. And he's sitting there trying to tell me about my mom's funeral, and I was like, thank you, I highly appreciate it, but save my life, please. Help me. And he's like, no, I can't. It's just, because most death penalty cases, their trial transcripts are 15, 20, 25, and up volumes. Each volume is approximately about 500 pages. And he's like, I just don't have the time to read that much. And I was like, no, it's one volume. And he's like, what do you mean one volume? Just to pick the jury? And I was like, no, I didn't have a jury. I said, it's one volume, 462 pages long, from let's start to you die. And that's where the attorney of him kicked in. He's like, you can't sentence the man to die in one single volume. I have the shortest death penalty trial in the state of Ohio, 2 3/4 days. And he couldn't wrap his mind around how small my trial was to sentence me to death. And for that reason alone, he took the transcript home that night and read it because it's so small. As he was reading it, he came across the coroner's testimony. This poor kid, his throat was cut from ear to ear. His trachea was wide open. Here's where his nursing came in, is he knows, because he worked for 15 years on trachea patients, if your windpipe is cut, you can't talk. If you're a trachea patient and you can plug it, you can find the hole and plug it, you could probably talk like this. Well, this kid's trachea was wide open. And the coroner backed up the witness, supposed witness, saying that this man could be running and screaming, please don't kill me, please don't kill me. And the coroner backed up that this man could do this. Well, Father Niels knew for a fact he couldn't. And not only did he not think it, he took it to 3 specialists just to cover himself to be absolutely sure, and showed him the autopsy pictures and said, is there any way this man could be running and screaming so that people can hear him? And they all said no. And not only did his throat was cut, is he had 350 milliliters of blood in his lungs and his stomach. So all this poor kid was doing was drowning on his own blood. So there's where the nurse of him kicked in. And that's why I say he had to be all 3 things. Because once he saw how short the trial was, and then he knew that the testimony from the coroner was false, he's like, well, what else is wrong? Maybe this guy is telling me the truth that he's innocent. And he started investigating 10 years after the fact. And the little things that he found so quickly and without that much effort was ridiculous, which then led us to even bigger and more important issues and facts that we found. Then we took those facts to a federal judge, and the federal judge ordered the prosecutor to turn over their files. Well, they did a thing what they call clean the files. They went through, and anything that was pertinent that could help me, they took out. And the only reason I know that is I'm sitting in my cell. They gave me a stack of paper about that thick. I got nothing to do but sit there. So I went through it page by page, line by line. They would give me a police report, and they would give me a 5-page police report, because it always says in the top corner how many pages it is. They'd give me page 1 and 3. So I wrote that down. I would be reading some more, and all of a sudden I'd find a supplemental report, but wouldn't find the original report that it was a supplement to. So I went through this and gave it to my attorneys, and the attorneys went back to the judge, and the judge said, okay, you want to play games? She widened the discovery. This time they sent me a stack about like this. I went through it, I did it again. They did it again. So we went back to the judge, and now this federal judge is to the point of telling them, I'm going to hold you in contempt if you do not turn everything over to him. And not only that, anybody's name that's mentioned in this case, you must turn him over those files to. And I don't want to hear the thing, it's work product. She says, there is no such thing as work product because you guys have ruined it by cheating and lying to this point, and I'm not going to stand it anymore. And they finally gave us what we thought was all the evidence, till I came back for retrial. 4 days before my retrial, in the morning, they filed a motion with the court. They stood up actually in court and told the judge, Your Honor, he has every last itty-bitty piece of evidence that has anything to do with anybody in this case. And the judge is like, okay, fine. We broke for lunch. We come back from lunch, and the prosecutor table's scrambling. And we're like, uh-oh, what's going on? Why are they over there running around like chickens with their heads cut off? So the judge started session. Prosecutor stood up and said, Your Honor, I hate to tell you this, but during lunch, we went into a closet that we haven't been in 22 years and found 7 more pieces of evidence. And the judge was irate. She's like, a closet in this building that you haven't been in 22 years. You want me to believe this, right? And they're like, yeah, Your Honor. And she was livid. But the problem with this was there was DNA evidence in there. There was tissue samples from the victim that were in there. Now, there's no DNA in my case, so I can't match that against, but I wanted those samples tested because I wanted to know for sure what this boy's DNA was because they had my hunting knives. I was a sportsman. The night before I was arrested, to show you how much bad luck I have, the night before I was arrested, I put my hand through a window by accident. And as I was running to my bathroom, every time my heart pumped, blood squirted on the walls. And dummy me, instead of just stopping where I am and wrapping it around, I run to the bathroom because I'm panicking, which is all the way in the back of my apartment. The whole time, there's blood squirting on the walls. So here comes the next day, and this is late at night. I finally got it to stop bleeding, and I went to sleep. Next morning, I'm like, okay, I'll clean it up tomorrow, no big deal. Then the cops came. And they're like, okay, this kid's all cut up, and look at all this blood all over the house. Gee, we found the murder scene. And it's like, no, it's my blood. Look at the bandage on my hand, which they immediately ripped off and threw into the corner and said, what bandage? Which that's a whole nother subject into itself because they illegally and unlawfully arrested me. They hid evidence. They actually took swabs of my wall, which magically disappeared once we found this man's DNA to match it because they kept eluding. We hurt the kid in my apartment and then took him to the creek and killed him. So now it's like, okay, I can prove that's my blood and I can prove it's not his because now we have DNA. So we were going to send it to the lab. But by doing so, put it past the 180-day mark that the federal judge granted them to retry me. And that's a long story into itself. But to get back to the main point of the task force and its findings, if the task force findings that they have were in place when I went to, excuse me, there goes the bronchitis again. If those recommendations were in place, I would have never got the death penalty. It's something that needs to be done if we're going to have this. But I'm a prime example why it shouldn't even exist. Because like Abe said, if it could happen to me, it can happen to you, or your kids, or your grandkids. And they don't hesitate because they're tough on crime. And if they think they got the right guy, or even if they don't think and they just want to solve it, and you're in the way, you mean absolutely nothing to them. And they are murdering in your name every time they execute. You know what they put on the death certificate when they execute a guy? Homicide. They are doing what they said I did. They are planning it out, thinking it out, and then killing somebody. And in your name. And if it wasn't for that priest, they would easily have killed me 10 years ago. And once they execute you, they get to destroy all the evidence. And the thing about that is, 80% of the evidence that we found that cleared me was in 3 places: the prosecutor's file, the police file, and the coroner's file. And it was there all along. It was there back in 1988. But they hid it from us. And they kept hiding. So don't think it can't happen to you or your kids, because it can. And I'm a prime example. They destroyed my life. They took 80% of my adult life, and they don't care. They do not care. It doesn't bother them one little bit. So I say to you, if we're not going to get rid of it, at least make it fair. Because the next guy might not have a Catholic priest or anybody to help him. Because like he said, 50% of the people that are on death row are mentally challenged. I knew 3 personally that couldn't read. They used to get letters from home and come to me and ask me to read them to them. How are they supposed to be able to defend themselves if they can't even read? When attorneys and the law has its own different dictionary. Because it's so different. So how is he supposed to defend himself, to know what's right and wrong and what's going on in the system? That's just scary. That your state is going to pick on the lowest of the low and throw them on death row. Because there is no rich people. Very, very, very few intelligent people are on death row. It's mostly mentally challenged, the sick, the mentally sick, or just poverty, race, all the issues that he said. It's all there, and I lived with it for 22 years. And it's got to stop. Thank you.
Who tells his story? Every time Terry tells his story, every time our next speaker tells their story, they're putting you into their pain, and they're putting themselves right back on death row, right back in the funeral home. This is tough work. I hope when you leave here tonight, you're ready to share what you've heard. And sooner or later, when you find yourself talking to people about this issue, and especially if, like me, you've come to a conclusion that it's time for some change. I used to be in favor of the death penalty. I changed my position. That's a whole other story. But when I find myself talking to the death penalty, one of the things people often say is, you'd feel different if it happened to you. And when that happens, I say, you're right, maybe it would. I have not had this experience. The worst crime I've experienced is somebody stole my bike when I was a kid. That's about as bad as it's got for me. I'm lucky. So I say, you're right, maybe I would feel different, but let me tell you about my friend Bill Pelkey. Let me tell you about my friend George White. Let me tell you about our next speaker, my friend and yours, Charles Keith.
Good evening. I've told this story several times. It's kind of difficult to keep it tight. First of all, I want to let you know that I am a board member of Ohioans to Stop Executions. A lot of people ask me, well, why would you join that organization? Why is it because you have a brother that's on death row? You would feel differently if you had a family member that had been murdered. And I tell them, I did. I had a brother that was murdered in 2007. He was shot in the back 3 times on a home invasion robbery that went bad. The people went to the wrong house. He surprised them, and he ended up getting murdered. I didn't have time to investigate that case. I had family members and other friends ask me, well, you investigated Kevin's case. Are you going to investigate this? I had to leave that to the police. I cannot bring Durad back. I had to keep all my resources, had to keep my mind focused because I'm fighting a death penalty case. I pray for Durad a lot. He's gone. They say, would you want the guy to receive the death penalty? No, because you're going to take and drag our family through 10, 15, 20 years. You're going to make us keep reliving this and reliving this and reliving this. We don't want to do that. To give a guy life without parole, it gives you closure. It gives you satisfaction. You know everybody's going to die. We know that. So if you give a guy life without parole, you know he's going to die inside there. So that is a version of the death penalty. You know, he's going to sit there a lot longer. We don't have to speed it up. We don't have to do any of that. And it's a lot cheaper. You know, we spend millions of dollars to execute one person when that money can be used to fight cancer. It can be used to put back into our education. It can be used to help our youth and maybe even our elderly. So those dollars are very valuable, and to see them wasted on taking a life, it's not productive. Once that person's dead, that money's gone also. It's like you're taking $4 million, putting it in the coffin with that guy and burying it. It's not productive, and that's not how money is supposed to be spent. If we're all supposed to be wise and know how to handle money, it's a total waste. Now I'll tell you about my brother Kevin. It's a terrible story. Kevin was convicted of a murder in 1994 in Bucyrus, Ohio. They said that a black man entered into the home, and there was 2 women shot and killed, and there was a child. There was 2 other people wounded and another child wounded. So they got him for 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder. They said that the perpetrator was from 5'8" to 6'8", and I was like, wow, that's that's crazy. Well, anyway, our family, we sat through the trial. We assumed that the trial would be fair. You trust the police, you trust your judicial system, and we knew that Kevin would be found innocent because he didn't do it. He had all the witnesses. I mean, everything was coming out. They were totally ignoring everything. He had witnesses sitting on the side that they never even called. It was a crazy case. Put these on. I didn't always wear these. Kevin, when I talked to him, he says, Charles, you know, they gave us an attorney. The attorney was not certified to handle capital cases. He was a single attorney. He tried to take all this on himself. The judge stated that first of all, he said he court-appointed this attorney, and then later, after things went awry, he says he didn't court-appoint this attorney. And I know that rarely will attorneys come on and take cases, you know, this costing $35 plus. So we could not understand why this guy took this case. And at the end of the trial, he says, well, you got what you paid for. And I'm thinking, well, we never gave you nothing. And I guess what he was telling us is neither did he. A gentleman wrote this quite some time ago, and it got me started investigating my brother's case. I spent, well, actually now 21 years of my life. I started this back in 1994. I was lost. I had no idea which way to turn, where to go. There was no support groups out there. There was no one out there that would help. And when you're talking about the death penalty, everyone's assuming he must be guilty. Well, there's a gentleman by the name of Martin Yant, and I met with Martin Yant. Someone says, well, give this guy a call. Well, I met with him. I could not afford him. But he gave me something, and I've held this thing for so many years, and it was citing some of the mistakes that was in my brother's case. So it was giving me some idea which direction to start going in. So, you know, and I'm going to briefly go over some of this stuff for you, but it definitely mentioned that the attorney who wasn't certified to handle capital cases, a carelessly selected and contaminated jury, and even the judge, after my brother was convicted, called him a snake in the grass. I mean, it was horrible. The case was never investigated. Kevin was never interrogated. They never asked him whether he did it or whether he didn't do it. He didn't even know actually that he was arrested for a murder. They came into the house, they beat him up, took him off, and He ended up on death row 30 days later, well, from February to May. They didn't investigate the case or ask for time to do so. They didn't move to excuse a juror who reported receiving threatening phone calls, a juror lying about discussing the case outside the courtroom, one reported receiving a collect call from a prison, and one seen being driven to the bank during sequestered deliberations. He didn't object to hearsay evidence. He didn't request a mistrial when the judge expressed fear for his own life. Didn't withdraw when he became aware he had a conflict of interest, and things go on and on and on. There were so many mistakes. I was like, oh my God, what do I do? Well, I was walking one day down the road, and there was a halfway house sitting next to me, and it says Correction Center. And I said, wow, I got to get in there. So I went in, I volunteered. It gave me access to documents. I'm in there, I was filing all their papers, filing all these documents, but I realized they were all legal documents. I was able to talk to a lot of inmates, and most inmates, they have a lot of information. And putting them all together, it was like I had a lawyer. I could ask them all type of hypothetical questions. These guys had done considerable amount of time in prison, so they were able to give me answers, and it didn't cost me anything. I would take the phone book, and I would also call attorneys, and I would ask them hypothetical questions, and I would write down their answers. So that got me started in my investigations. So I go and I start talking to Kevin, because the appellate attorneys that we had, I'm not going to say that they didn't do a good job, but I can say that they didn't do a good job. Kevin says, Charles, with you at my attorney, I'm surely going to die. So we talked about that. I says, hey, man, I'm all you got right now. So I started my investigation, and with working in that correctional center that I was at, it taught me what the documents were. It showed me what I was looking for. Well, when I went to the police department, they were laughing, they're very jovial, and they says, well, you can have whatever you want back there, and that was under the Public Information Act. I went back there and I grabbed everything, and then I went home and I was able to sort things out, because in order to explain something to somebody, you have to show things. This is one of those cases that didn't have DNA. They had no physical evidence, so there was nothing that I could argue against other than their theory. So I had to come up with my own theory. So I had newspapers all over the carpet, all kinds of documents that I had found. I slept on the couch, but my carpet, my whole front room was just all documents, all papers. And I would go to sleep, and in that dream, and in dreamlike state, I was able to put these things together. So I knew that it was God working in me to help me understand this case, because it was so complex, and I didn't have a clue of what I was doing. I would get up the next morning, and I was moving papers like chess, to make sure how these things worked. And I was like, oh my God. So now I'm sitting around all day long. I wouldn't even leave the house. I couldn't wait to go back to sleep so I could continue to get this thing going. So I'm sitting there all day. Finally, I would fall asleep. And again, it would come to me. I'd get up the next day, and I'm shuffling and moving papers. I mean, it was unbelievable. So, I go to the Bible, and I read the Bible a lot, but it just wasn't in me. I didn't feel it. I could sit and talk the Bible with anybody, but that works piece was missing in my life. It wasn't there, to just talk the Bible. And so I flipped it open one day, and it flipped to the trial of Jesus Christ. I says, oh my God. So I read that over and over and over and over. And I says, well, Charles, what would you do if you had been there? I don't know. So I thought about it for a while. I says, I would like to think that I would have spoke up. I would like to think that I would fight. I'd like to think that I would have done something. So something inside me says, well, fight now like you were fighting for Jesus Christ. So I fought for my brother with that same compassion, that same passion. It was just in me. It was a drive. And that has compelled me to continue on for these 21 years. Kevin's case was commuted, and I have to thank the Ohio Public Defender's Office, because when we finally got them involved and got some of this evidence to them, they worked profusely. It was unbelievable. It was amazing how they came together, how they worked as a team, and how they saved my brother's life, because I realized that I couldn't do it. I couldn't represent him, and to see how they just put everything out there. I haven't seen Tim in a while. He's here in this audience. So I've got to bring some attention to him. I really must do that because he has meaning in my life, as well as some of his attorneys. I wish they were here too. I would single them all out. So it's not like I did all this by myself. There's a lot of people that come to my aid. That's one thing when you get in trouble, you think you're back there by yourself, and it takes you to that little poem, the footprints in the sand. Well, you've always got somebody there to help you. God's always going to put somebody in your life. Sometimes you just forget that. Well, we're going on, and Kevin's case was commuted by Governor Strickland. This is the first case that was commuted by a governor for going against his parole board. The parole board voted 8-0 to execute. I sat there during that clemency, and it was like watching a death squad. I mean, they were just there. And we put on this clemency for almost 12 to 14 hours. I mean, they said this is one of the longest ones in history. It was unbelievable, the evidence and the information that we had put on, the people that had came out in support of Kevin. It was just unbelievable. And after all that was said and done, we didn't convince not one of them, not one. And these are supposed to be educated, highly educated people. How could we not convince just one when I had to help convince the public defender's office? There were so many people that I had to convince, and they saw it. But they didn't see this. And I said, this is a death squad. They're not interested in the truth. They're going to get this execution. That's what I thought was going to happen. Well, I sat by the phone for several days. The phones kept ringing. It wasn't the attorney. The phone would ring. It wasn't the attorney. Now I'm going nuts. Well, the phone rang. It was the attorney. She says, well, they commuted your brother's sentence. Ah, yes. But they gave him life without parole. Now I got to explain that to my family. It took a while for it to register in my head. I said, how could they take him? And based on what we said, and our only claim was innocent. It wasn't child abuse. It wasn't mental retardation. There was no type of drugs or anything. It was actual innocence. In fact, when I went to the Ohio Public Defender's Office, they said he had no more appeals. We were done with appeals. I said, but I have all this information. They said, bring down what you have. I came down with boxes, suitcases of everything that I had gathered, because I tell them, even in a sentence, that sentence is not complete until it has a period. So I knew everything meant something, only I wasn't that attorney to be able to do all that. So I was able finally to get it to some attorneys and get this thing done. Let's get this ball rolling. So we got the sentence commuted. They gave him life without parole. This was back in 2010. So now I'm out here fighting a wrongful conviction. So I'm out here, I have to rehash the same information. And I tell myself, wow, didn't I just tell them all this? So, you know, that energy level, you start losing that drive. But here again, here comes my Lord and Savior. He says, hey, you got to get on out there. He says, they've been talking about me since my execution. And how long has that been? So I have to have that same passion, that same everything. I got that same drive because I can't let it go. Just like we can't let go of what happened to him. That's what makes us who we are. So here again, I'm fighting for Kevin Keith. And I've come across some people, again, he sent me some people to help me. Last night, a gentleman was sitting in the audience, and he came up to me, and he says, hey, you know, and he was a private investigator. And he says, you know, I think I got a couple ideas that could possibly help you. Wow. So coming to these events, you never know who you're going to talk to. You never know who's who. You never know who's related to anyone. So there's a lot of networking out there. There's a lot of good people out there. There's some bad ones, but, you know, we're human. If half these recommendations, some of these recommendations have been put in place back then, especially videotaping interrogations and all that stuff, and Kevin wasn't even interrogated. That's why I couldn't find that information. Some of those things put in to safeguard these things, to make sure that things are done fairly, and that's what we're looking for. You know, I'd like to see the death penalty totally abolished, but we're working on that. At one time, I thought it was me out there by myself, and I was campaigning to eliminate the death penalty. That was my job, to abolish the death penalty. Well, once I hooked up with this organization of Ohioans to Stop Executions, I had to tone it down just a hair, because it wasn't just about my brother Kevin. It was about everybody on death row. It was about the death penalty. So I understood what this mission was. And meeting some of the people on that panel, attorneys, private investigators, prosecutors, people such as Abe, it was unbelievable. I said, look at all the people that God has brought into my life. I've learned so much. It's unbelievable. I help people now try to understand how the law works, because there's so many people out there that is ignorant to the law. As I was ignorant to the law. You give them a bunch of papers, and that's exactly what it is. They set it over and it collects dust. And they didn't understand. So now I do have some understanding, so I can help them understand, or what to say to your attorney, or, you know, how to interact with your attorney. I tell people that I wasn't educated by Ohio State, but I was educated by the state of Ohio. And I want to thank you. Excuse me. This is my brother, Kevin Keith. This is a book that is going to be coming out pretty soon. It's a documentary. It's being done by Kent State University, John Butte, and it says Innocent for Life. This was given to me to share with my family, and what this did, it showed that someone cared. When I took this to my mother, she cried. But it did. It showed that someone cared, and that's what you need sometime. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. We're going to take some questions now, but just before we do, I want to ask my colleagues, Charles and Joe, to help me share this. I'm going to give each person one of these. We're also going to give each person one of these. And I want to ask you to take a few minutes and, if you would, fill this out before you leave. It's 3 postcards. One that goes to the governor, one that goes to your state representative, one that goes to your state senator, that simply asks them to give full and fair consideration to these recommendations. Okay, and there's a box you can check at the top that says, I'm against the death penalty, but if we're going to have the death penalty, let's make sure it's fair and accurate. There's another box that says, I support the death penalty, but if we're going to have the death penalty, let's make sure it's fair and accurate. That's what this is about, is letting people know what's happening and giving people the opportunity to share with their legislators that we need to have these recommendations fully considered. On the side here, if we can follow up with you and keep in touch with what's happening, and we're going to try to do more of these things in this area and let you know when that's happening so you can tell others, hey, you got to go hear this story. Fill out this part, and don't take it apart, just leave the whole thing with me. If you don't want to be on our list, just do the postcards, please. And if you're not up to doing the postcards, take it with you, think about it. At the end of the day, it's up to you whether you want to make a difference on this. And finally, I want to put an envelope in each person's hand also. And this envelope is addressed to Ohioans to Stop Executions, to our office. If you have a comment and want to share with us, please do. And if you'd like to help us keep this show on the road, I want to share with you that there are people such as, I don't want to share their names, but there's a couple that live near Dayton who the wife of this couple used to support the death penalty, and she came and heard our executive director talking once and learned a lot of things that she didn't know about the death penalty, and now they're among our biggest supporters. Well, they've given us a $10,000 match, and every dollar that's donated until we hit $10,000 is doubled by this couple that used to support the death penalty and now are helping make this happen, these kinds of talks. So any donation that's received until we hit $10,000 is automatically doubled, and we're at about $5,000 right now, so I invite your support with that. And with that, questions, comments? And please let us know who you're questioning so that that person can respond.
Yeah, I think it's for you.
Okay.
I believe you were the one that mentioned that one reason you came to Wilmington was because we're represented by Cliff Rosenberger. Would I be safe in assuming that's because he is quite possibly going to be the next Speaker of the House?
Yes, in fact, we only started organizing this event about 2 weeks ago now. When we learned that that was a possibility, because we can't talk to every legislator, but the people that drive what happens are the people in leadership. So the Speaker of the House, the Senate President. The first one of these that we did was in Wapakoneta, which is not technically in Senate President Faber's district, but it's surrounded by it. And so we did that back in May, right before they released this report. But we wanted to make sure that Senator Faber also knows and that his constituents are aware of these recommendations and want to have full consideration of it. The idea that it should just be dismissed because the Prosecuting Attorneys Association doesn't want to lose a little bit of its power is absurd if we're concerned about fairness in the system. So that's why we're picking where we go with these things. Media markets and key legislative districts of leadership, people on the Senate and House Judiciary Committees.
Are you aware of his position on
No.
the death penalty or on the recommendations?
No, we're not, and we're taking this everywhere because we don't want this to be easily dismissed. We want citizens, people, to understand what the issues are, so that we can talk to our legislators and let them know that we're concerned. hopefully Cliff Rosenberger is a reasonable guy that will take the time to read this report and to hear what his constituents think, and actually to speak to the people like these and others of the task force members, and to have them come to hearings and testify as to what they found and why they found it and why they made these 56 recommendations and why they're important, and that they actually sit and listen to this stuff. I mean, I've worked on a lot of campaigns in a lot of states, and it's stunning the kind of ignorance that happens in legislative hearings, and people doing other things, not being present. That's why we have to do this. We have to say this out loud, repeatedly. We have to make sure that other people, the people that are going to bump into Cliff Rosenberger or whoever their representative is at the supermarket, at the park, wherever it is, where you can have a conversation outside of the glaring lights of the media and lobbyists and all that. People need to know so that they can talk to their representatives and let them know what they think. And that's why Ohioans to Stop Executions and its many partners are, making this happen. All of these people here are volunteers. All of these people are taking time from, their own lives because they've got a story to tell. Yes.
This is a question for Tim, whatever. Tim, that guy. You mentioned that A.G. Husted was part of the group that was working with you. Where does he stand?
The Attorney General?
Yeah, the Attorney General.
Our present Attorney General is in favor of the death penalty.
But where does he stand with the 56 recommendations to try to be more fair and accurate?
In the recommendations, if you want to receive a copy of them, there's actually a vote count next to each one of them.
Okay.
And almost any time you see a vote against, it was the Attorney General or a prosecutor, one or both. If there's a single vote against, it was generally at least one of the prosecutors. Where you see any vote count that has two or more, it was the Attorney General and one of the prosecutors voting against the recommendation. It is difficult to describe the divisiveness in that room when it became clear about 4 minutes into the first meeting that the prosecutors and Attorney General had come with a mission which had nothing to do with making the death penalty more fair, but only in preserving what they had today. So most of these votes were not unanimous, and unfortunately there was a consistent minority voting against, and it was the same 3 or 4 voices.
Okay. Well, then, my backup is, what about the people, Nina Turner
Yes.
is running against him. Where does she stand on implementing these recommendations?
I don't know.
Okay. That's a good question to ask her.
While you're up there, I have a question.
Sure.
There was a lot of information, and I feel like I've missed about half of it. But there was something specific mentioned a couple of times about recording interrogations. Since we don't have someone here tonight from the task force who opposed that recommendation, what I'm wondering if you can do is tell me what the best argument against recording interrogations is, and then tell me why you think it's wrong.
There were 2 arguments that were primarily put up against recording interrogations. The first was we don't have the equipment. I will get them all equipment if they need it. I can get donations of video cameras to fill every police agency in this state, and I can get them tomorrow. But more honestly, there's not a police officer in this state who's not carrying a smartphone today who can't take it out and click record on their smartphone. Recording equipment is too ubiquitous today for that to be an excuse anymore. Maybe 15 years ago you could make that argument, but not today. There's not a police officer today who's not carrying on his shoulder, connected to his radio, a system that he could turn on and have dispatch record it for him. It is impossible to not have equipment to record. The second biggest issue was, well, what if they just start talking to us? And we're not asking them questions. And how can we, they confess suddenly, I did it, take me in, and we haven't even asked them a question. You're telling us we can't use that, and our answer was, it's the red herring. That's not included. We're talking about custodial interrogations. Custodial interrogations require two things. One, that you're in custody, and two, that there be an interrogation, that there be a question asked and an answer and response. An excited utterance, a voluntary statement by a defendant is not a custodial interrogation. It's a voluntary confession, and it would be admissible. But those were the two. Mike DeWine's the Attorney General today. His representative, who was there, former Clark County prosecutor, and I'm going to forget his name, who was the actual representative for him at the John Husted is not on there. John Husted is the Secretary of State, has nothing to do with this. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the name you mentioned.
Okay.
They're actually recording. So, and also, it's part of our testimony of equality for people with hearing disabilities.
Sorry, Sharon. You're next. This is for Terry, former warden. And I think it's a pretty simple one, but you didn't make it completely clear that your one of your biggest concerns was for the victims. And did you met both victims of both the crime and the victims of the person that was executed?
Yes, I actually had my office had a victims services office. I think at that time we had 7 or 8 people who handled victims. Karen Ho was our lead victims advocate, and she actually would spend the night in Portsmouth we would arrange for their hotel. We would escort them to the prison. They stayed with them the entire time during the execution. After the execution, escorted them out, and oftentimes Karen and her staff would spend several hours after the execution with both families, if they so chose. I mean, they had the option, and most of them did.
I know this is about Ohio, but do you know how many of the states still have the death penalty? I know that I like to travel abroad, and what I have found that there are very few foreign countries that use the death penalty anymore. So, but I don't really know how many of the 50 states that still have it.
Well, internationally, the death penalty has fallen into a lot of disuse, and in fact, in Europe, you cannot be a member, your country cannot be a member of the European Economic Community without actually abolishing the death penalty. Here in here in the United States, it's important to know that in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down all death penalty laws in the country in a case called Furman versus Georgia. And that forced any state that wanted to have the death penalty to write new death penalty laws, which many did. Florida was the first. They had a special session in November of that year just to bring the death penalty back into that state. And the first Supreme Court decision that upheld the new laws was Gregg versus Georgia in 1976, and that actually was a combination of 5 states that had done this. But by the time we got to New York, became the last state to reinstate the death penalty, which they did in the 90s, and that made it 38 states with the death penalty, plus the military, plus the federal government. Now, since then, in New York's death penalty was actually struck down by the courts in New York in 2005, and in 2007 that was affirmed, and we were able also to stop legislation from fixing it. So New York was the first state to abandon the use of its death penalty, the last state to put it in, the first state to get rid of it. Also in 2007, New Jersey became the first state to legislatively repeal the death penalty, which they did in 2007, the first state since 1964. And then since then, in 2011, New Mexico, 2009, New Mexico, 2011, Illinois, 2012, Connecticut, 2013, Maryland, all have legislatively repealed the death penalty, and those other states that are lining up, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Delaware, those are states that are considering repeal legislation. And then there's other states like Ohio, which would be a high-use state, where the opportunity for reform exists. So if we're going to keep the death penalty, then at least let's make it fair and accurate. So that leaves us right now with 32 states, plus the military, plus the federal government. Yeah. Well, the thing is, if you look at how many have it on their statute and then how many are actually using it, that's a whole different story, because you have states like New Hampshire, Wyoming, Montana, that have people on death row but are not going to execute anybody. And I want to point, New Jersey is one of those states. That's why it was one of the first to get rid of it. And I'll just, to make an example and take this opportunity, and then I want to take one or two more questions. It's already after 9 o'clock, so that we can have a chance for people to get home and also have a chance to chat. But I want to just share with you that in New Jersey, their death penalty law was written in 1982. And of all the murders that occurred in New Jersey between 1982 and 2004, of all of them, where they actually caught somebody, and they catch people for murder about half the time, so a lot of murders go unsolved, where they caught people, they were eligible for the death penalty in about 254 cases. So all those murders, there were 600 death-eligible cases, and they tried for the death penalty in 254 of those cases. So out of all the murders where they caught somebody, where they were death-eligible, 600, they could have tried. 254, they did try. 60, they got a death sentence. And by the time we got to the point of repealing the death penalty in New Jersey, only 8 people out of those 60 were still on death row. And their sentences were all commuted to life imprisonment by Governor Corzine just before he signed that bill. And I want to point that out simply because when people say, I was the director of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty for a number of years, and every time they would kill somebody, the politicians would get out there. Jeb Bush was the governor then, and I like Jeb Bush. He's a good guy. He's a nice guy, but he would get out there and say, we're doing this for the victim families. And if it's true that the death penalty is a commodity for the victim families, then what we're saying to the vast majority of murder victim families is your loved one wasn't valuable enough. Because we only seek the death penalty in about 3% of cases where we can seek the death penalty, and we only get the death penalty and keep them on death row to the point of execution in fewer than 1% of the cases where the death penalty is possible. So the death penalty is not a commodity for victim families, because we're telling most victim families your loved one wasn't valuable enough. That's one of the most upsetting things about this issue for me. Carved into the face of the United States Supreme Court building are the words equal justice under law. And that is not what we have. Doesn't matter if you favor the death penalty or not. If you believe in this idea of equal justice under law, if you believe in this idea of fairness, then I'm asking for your help tonight and moving forward. Let's have one ultimate punishment, and that can be life without parole.
So we've talked tonight all about why we should get rid of the death penalty. But what's the other side? The side that says that the death penalty is a deterrent. Has that been pretty well wiped out? Because I won't commit this crime because I'm afraid I'll be executed.
The question is the death penalty a deterrent, and what do the studies say? Well, I can't cite chapter and verse on this, but what I can tell you is that the National Academy of Sciences, 2 years ago now, came out with a report that basically analyzed all of the deterrent studies and said that none of them are credible enough for the National Academy of Sciences to make any determination. And they've said you can't make this argument because none of these studies can be upheld. And if you think about it, you don't you either go into a place knowing that you're going to murder somebody and not planning to get caught, or you go into a place committing another crime and not planning to murder somebody and still not planning to get caught. So in fact, where you have, I think you can even show, and I don't think this study has been done, but you can show that people are more likely to commit murder if they think they're going to get caught and they think they can get away. And in fact, in states that have the death penalty, you are more likely to be killed as a law enforcement officer than in states that don't. And in fact, in the states, New Jersey, New Mexico, Illinois, and New York, as of last April, murder of law enforcement officers has either gone down or maintained its level after the state has abolished the death penalty. Okay, Connecticut and Maryland, it was too soon to tell, but we could see a distinct drop or a maintenance of the same level of murders of law enforcement officers once the death penalty was gone. This is one of the things we're up against in our campaign in Delaware, where our chief opposition is the law enforcement community, who are afraid that cops are going to be shot down on every corner if we don't have the death penalty to protect them. And it's just not true. It's a culture that we have of violence that we can step away from. I invite you to join us in that effort. There's coffee and snacks down the hall. We're happy to hang out and chat with people as long as people want to talk, and we look forward to seeing you again next time we're here. Thank you.